Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. In our last video, we looked at agreement and saw that contract requires offer and acceptance. But here's the thing, just because two people reach an agreement doesn't necessarily mean they've made a contract. Think about it. You agree to meet a friend for coffee. You agree to mow the lawn if your partner washes the dishes. You agree to give your child £10 if they tidy their room. All of these are agreements, but are they contracts? Well, usually not. And that's where today's topic comes in, the topic of intention to create legal relations. So what's the big picture here? Well, to create a binding contract, we need three ingredients: agreement, intention, and consideration. We've dealt with agreement, and today we're looking at that second requirement. And the key question to ask when it comes to intention is, did the parties intend this agreement to be legally binding? Because if they didn't, the courts generally will not enforce it. So why does this rule exist? Well, the law doesn't want to become involved in every promise that people make. Imagine the courts dealing with disputes such as, you promised to take the bins out, you said we'd go shopping tomorrow, you said you would walk the dog. The legal system would spend its entire time resolving domestic arguments. The law, therefore, draws a distinction between agreements people expect to enforce through the courts and agreements people expect to sort out for themselves. Now, the mechanism used to make that distinction is this concept of intention. So let's now look at the role of presumptions. So the good news is that courts don't start from scratch every time. Instead, they use a series of presumptions. And for SQE purposes, there are only two you need to remember. One applies to commercial agreements, the other applies to domestic agreements. And the trick is identifying which category you're dealing with. Let's start with commercial agreements. Now, when we say commercial agreements, we don't just mean agreements between businesses. We also mean agreements between businesses and consumers, online purchases, retail transactions, and private sales of goods. In short, if people are engaged in some sort of commercial transaction, this category is likely to apply. And the law begins with a very strong presumption. The parties intended their agreement to be legally binding. In other words, the courts start from the position that legal consequences were intended. Now, why is this presumption so strong? Well, the answer is actually quite straightforward. Commerce depends on certainty. Businesses need confidence that agreements can be enforced. Consumers need confidence that promises made in a commercial setting will be honoured. Imagine buying a television and when it failed to arrive, being told, we never intended this to be legally binding. The commercial world simply wouldn't function. And that's why the courts are so reluctant to conclude that a commercial agreement lacks legal intention. Now, does the value of the agreement matter? Well, not necessarily. Students often assume that only large transactions create legal obligations, but the courts don't ask how much money was involved. They are in fact asking, what type of agreement is this? Even agreements involving relatively small amounts may be treated as legally binding if they are commercial in nature. Now, can the presumption be rebutted? Yes, but it's difficult. In fact, it's very difficult. The person arguing that there was no intention to create legal relations must point to clear evidence that the agreement was never meant to have legal consequences. Usually, that means very explicit wording, something along the lines of, this agreement is binding in honour only. Without clear evidence of that kind, commercial agreements will almost always be treated as legally enforceable. So how should you approach commercial scenarios? Well, whenever you encounter a commercial arrangement, your starting position should be simple. Ask yourself, is this a commercial agreement? If the answer is yes, the law assumes that legal consequences were intended. The burden then falls on the person arguing the opposite. Unless there is very strong evidence that the agreement was never meant to be legally binding, the court will usually conclude that intention exists. Now, let's turn to domestic agreements. And these are agreements between spouses, partners, parents and children, siblings, close friends. And here, the law takes the opposite approach. Instead of presuming legal intention, it begins by presuming the absence of legal intention. This is known as the domestic presumption. So the starting point is the parties did not intend to create legal relations, and the law assumes that most family members and friends are not expecting to end up in court if their agreement falls apart. Instead, they are expected to resolve their disagreements privately, and that reflects how most people actually behave. Nobody normally threatens legal action because somebody forgot to mow the lawn or buy the milk on the way home. Now, does that mean that family members can never make contracts? Not at all. And this is where many students get caught out. Remember, we're dealing with a presumption, not an absolute rule. A domestic agreement can still be legally binding if the facts show that legal consequences were intended. Now, what facts are relevant? Well, the court looks at the overall circumstances. For example, how serious is the arrangement? How much money is involved? Has the agreement been formalized? Were solicitors involved? Are the parties dealing with one another at arm's length? The more formal and serious the arrangement becomes, the more likely it is that the domestic presumption will be rebutted. Quickly, we're just going to have a look at a few different examples, starting with divorcing couples. So when you look at a divorcing couple, they could well be negotiating financial arrangements. And this may have started as a domestic relationship, but the circumstances then have often changed. The parties are often dealing through solicitors. Large sums of money may be involved. Formal documentation may exist, and a reasonable person would be much more likely to conclude that legal consequences were intended. When it comes to friends in business, the same type of thinking would apply. So they may have entered into a business venture together, they're still friends, but they're now operating in a commercial environment. Money is involved, risk is involved, responsibilities are involved. The court is therefore much more likely to find the necessary intention. Similarly, if we look at property transactions between relatives, so if one relative is selling a house to another, although they're family members, the subject matter is significant. The arrangement will usually be documented and formal. Again, the court is likely to find that the presumption has been rebutted. So how should you approach domestic scenarios? Well, whenever you encounter a domestic agreement, start by recognizing that the law assumes there was no intention to create legal relations. Then ask yourself, is the arrangement serious? Is a substantial amount of money involved? Has the agreement been formalized? Would a reasonable observer expect legal consequences to follow? If the answer to those questions is yes, then the presumption may well be overcome. Let's have a quick look now at the SQE exam trap that often comes in here. Students often focus too much on what the parties later claim they intended, and that is dangerous. The courts don't simply ask, what did these people say they intended? Instead, they ask, what would a reasonable person think? And that objective approach runs throughout contract law. The court looks at what happened, what was said, and the surrounding circumstances. Then it decides whether a reasonable observer would have concluded that legal consequences were intended. Let's get now to Bowdie's bottom line. Every intention question starts with one issue. Did the parties intend this agreement to be legally binding? Now, the easiest way to answer that is to identify the type of agreement. If it's a commercial agreement, the law starts by assuming that legal consequences were intended. If it's a domestic agreement, the law starts by assuming the opposite. The real question then becomes whether the facts support or rebut that starting assumption. And remember, agreement alone is not enough. the parties must intend their agreement to have legal consequences. Without that intention, there is no binding contract. Thank you for watching this Bowdie Shorts. We'll be looking in the next episode at the next aspect of contract law. Hopefully we can have you along. Thank you very much.